Here I'm going to finish my project that I started with the last video. The center portion of this quilt is already quilted, and now what I'm going to do is add the side pieces that I have made blocks to add to the side. Now, because the center part is already quilted, I can add the side pieces by quilting them and then adding them using the regular quilt as you go method, that is using little narrow strips of fabric on the top and the bottom to join them together. But in this case, I have sewn 4 of the blocks together. I am going to use a flip and quilt method. So the backing, the batting are all basically the same size. And I have a piece for each side. So in this case, I have already sewed a seam down one side, joining the 4 blocks to the quilted backing. Now it's time to take this off the wall and add on the back side the backing and the batting. So basically I'm sandwiching the quilted portion in between the backing, batting, and at the other side the front pieces, the front blocks that I have made to finish off the length of the quilt. And you see along the wall, yes, then I'm going to quilt that piece individually. And it's easy to do because all I have is a 10-inch strip to quilt, and it's very easy to do with just a straight line quilting. So you see at the side I have 6 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 blocks to go across the top. And at the other side of my wall, I have 7 to go across the bottom. And likewise, I'm going to join those together with a flip and sew method, in which I'm going to sew the finished blocks on the front side, right sides together, and the backing and batting on the back side. Then all I have to do is quilt the 10 inches along each side, and it's an easy thing to do. The majority of the quilt never gets anywhere close to the needle. It's all just laying on the side of my table. So when I'm pinning these together, I have a nice flat surface in which to pin them. And I'm going to just make sure that the raw edges match together so that the seams are even. And because I'm using a striped backing, I want to make sure that the stripes are also going to be aligned so they're not on an acute angle at the back and make it look like it doesn't really fit together. Usually I sew the front blocks on first. That way I can check to make sure that the seams are lined up and that the pieces are going to fit well without any puckering. Then I sew the back on with the batting. I like to make sure that the seam is, maybe the batting seam is just, the batting seam allowance is just a little narrower, so when everything is laid out flat and smoothed down, it is going to lie nice and flat at the seam. I haven't really had much of a problem sewing things together like this, and you can continue to add as many borders around the outside as you like. This way you can just keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger until you run out of space or your bed is covered or whatever you're making has the length and size that you want. It's really an easy thing to do. I like to put lots of pins in, especially at the bottom of it where it might sort of try to fold up or get under my presser foot when I'm sewing. So I always put a few pins along the bottom side as well, and that keeps the quilted quilt batting side nice and flat and even, and it doesn't get in my way when I'm sewing. So there we go. It's pinned on. Now I'm going to sew that piece. And you see it's just a regular walking foot that I use. I'm following the same line of stitching that I use to sew the front blocks on, and that way the seam allowances are all nice and even. It doesn't take long to sew down the side. Just take your time and keep everything flat and even, and make sure that you can hold the side out straight perpendicular from the presser foot so that you have no chance of getting things caught up underneath. Usually when you're doing this kind of sewing, the seams are not very long, so it doesn't take very much time at all to sew those things together. Now that it's sewn, I take the pins out of the batting where I put them so it would hold them all together nice and straight. And then the pins I took out as I sewed the seam so that the needle didn't go over top of them. So I check the back to make sure that there's no tucks or puckers on the back. Then I lay it out flat so that the front of the quilt is going to also lie flat. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to quilt this section that I just sewed on. And usually the first row is going to be very close to the seam that I just sewed to make sure that the batting and backing are all secured nice and neatly, and where the seam is with that extra little bit of batting, it is going to hold it down and not allow it to sort of lift up. Here I've turned the camera sideways so you get a better look, but I'm also sideways, so I hope it doesn't bother you. But everything is nice and smooth. The line is quite straight as I get when I sew something. And there I'm going to just sew my first row of quilting on that new section very close to the seam allowance so it holds down all the layers and keeps them laid flat. And then I'm just going to do straight line stitching all the way across. So here's a picture of after all the two side pieces are added, the two top and bottom are added, and then I added a border that was 4.5 inches all the way around and did the same thing, flip and sew, and it's finished. I just need to bind it.